going to be talking about teaching through tasks, both because that's how I teach and how I've been taught about language acquisition and how to best promote it. So I want to start a little bit with sort of a preview of my teaching philosophy. I'm going to come back to this later, but I didn't want to just leave you guessing. So basically, what I try to do is what's called leading from behind, which we've often used in the task-based literature to talk about the role of the teacher, that the teacher sets the stage for learning and complements and supports the task and the students as they move through the task. But I think that it's something that you can do in all teaching. With my kids, I more jokingly, my personal children, not my students, I refer to it a little bit more as brainwashing. I don't really think it's so much brainwashing in the classroom, but sort of planting the seeds for the ideas that you're going to come back to so that you get them thinking about things, hopefully before you really address them. And that way they can have perspectives and questions, and sort of we can all be on the same page as issues come forward. And what I really try to do is make material that's relevant to students' interests, experiences, and objectives. My ultimate goal for my students is to leave the class feeling both more knowledgeable about the subject matter, but also ready to take on whatever their next career or educational goal is. So hopefully they will find something in my class that will take them to the next place in their own journey. So first I thought that I'd talk about what a task is. And I like this definition of a task from Samuda and Bygate, which says that a task is a holistic activity which engages language use in order to achieve some non-linguistic outcome while meeting a linguistic challenge, with the overall aim of promoting language learning through process or product or both. So in the language learning classroom, basically what we're trying to do is give students an opportunity to do something that is meaningful, that has a goal that isn't language related, but that in order to attain that goal, they will have to use language and push themselves to be better in the language that they're studying. So why do I like teaching through tasks in the language classroom and teaching language teachers to teach through tasks? Well, first of all, research shows that learners need to use language in order to learn it. So I actually, I've always been a big reader, and as a child I read all of these sort of older novels that featured all of these children in older past times sitting there translating lines of Latin, and that was actually how I thought language learning would be when I was a child, because I read too many books. And I was slightly disappointed to find out that I wouldn't be, given 10 lines to translate for homework when I started taking language classes. But as we all know, that's not actually, it might be fine for something like Latin where you're not really going to speak it, but for all of these living languages that we actually need to use, we have to actually use the language. We can't just translate 10 lines of Latin for homework. Tasks provide students and learners with opportunities for meaningful language use. So what the goal is for students to integrate language use, which allows them to focus on form, meaning the language that they're studying, while simultaneously focusing on content. In other words, tasks draw attention to form in the context of meaning. So what might an example of this be in a language learning classroom? One task that gets or type of task that gets a lot of attention in research is tasks that require students to ask questions. So a very popular task is like a picture differences task. So I have one picture, you have another picture, our pictures are the same, but there are 10 ways that our pictures are different. So I have to ask you questions to figure out what the differences are, or you have to ask me questions to figure out what the differences are between our two tasks. So on the one hand, this is something that we do in real life, starting with, if anyone still reads newspapers, there's always the spot the difference panels in the comic section of the newspaper. But very often we might be having a conversation with somebody who's removed in time or space, and we're trying to figure out why something isn't working. So asking questions to figure out what the problem is definitely a skill that we all need to have. So the task itself, because we have to do it in a classroom, is slightly constrained, but it gives us opportunities to use real-world languages. So if you don't ask the right questions, you're not going to complete the goal of the task. We find that in these things, students do get stuck, and they need to help each other. Sometimes the goal might be to use, for example, questions in this task that I'm talking about, but other things will come up. I have a paper where there's a published example in it where we had 2 students who were learning Spanish as a foreign language. They were asking each other questions about a task that's a picture of 2 park scenes. And there's different numbers of things, different numbers of birds, different numbers of whatever, different numbers of people. And one student asks the other student, how many pairs do you have? Using the Spanish word pareja, which is pairs. And the other person responds and says, pairs of lovers, because there's, I mean, they're not the most fluent, so it might not be the best choice, pairs of lovers, but it was people holding hands, so that was how they expressed themselves. And they have this whole breakdown, and it turns out that the first person who asked the question confused the word pareja with the word pájaro, which is bird. And there are a lot of little birds in the park, and so while the goal here had been ostensibly getting them practice answering questions, it also gave them the opportunity to realize that they had these 2 not dissimilar sounding words mixed up, and hopefully that was something that they remembered moving forward. So we have all these tasks, but we also need to think about what the role of the teacher is in these tasks, and ideally it's not just to hand these things out to the students and step back while they go, but to guide the students' attention from form to meaning and from meaning to form in a way that draws the learner's attention not just to the language of the task and not just to the goal of the task, but to the way that these 2 form and meaning aspects connect to form the meaning. And that if you say something one way, you might get a meaning that you didn't anticipate. And we can mind tasks for different purposes. Like I said, with this park differences thing, the idea was question formation, but it turned out to also be a great opportunity for learning vocabulary related to the park. So I brought a task for you to do today, which is to write a haiku. So presumably everyone knows, but just as a bit of a review, haiku is a Japanese style of poetry. Each poem has 3 lines. The first line has 5 syllables, the second line has 7 syllables, and the third line has 5 syllables. So what do you need? You need a pen or pencil, paper, and a slice of fruit, but I brought all these things for you in case you don't have them. Common Core English Language Arts standards for 7th grade include analyzing the form or structure of a story, poem, or drama, so you could do that. The WIA Language Arts standards for 6th and 8th grade include brainstorming words and using synonyms and antonyms. You all were great at coming up with all of these words, but clearly everybody's speaking English at the level they need to be speaking English at, but you can imagine doing this in another language that you didn't have such proficiency in, and that you would have been doing things like, it's not sweet. What's the word that means the opposite of that? So you already sort of touched on this. What was the language that you were using? What lessons could you imagine using this task in? So syllables, if we're talking about syllable structure, adjectives, even food vocabulary, if we were looking specifically at what do we use to talk about food, anything else that you can think of. So some tasks are very, very targeted and you use them for something very specific. Some things like the haiku task are a little bit more open and they can have a lot of different things. So imagining that you were actually student teachers instead of all the many things that you are. If I were using this with you in class, my immediate goal would be for you to have experience doing something like this, so that you could then design a pedagogical task that promotes content and language learning for whatever your teaching goal is. Are you going to be, you know, a kindergarten ESL teacher? Are you going to be a high school Spanish teacher? What are you going to be? And over time, I would hopefully be in a position to help you create a classroom task sequence that balances a focus on content and meaning with a focus on language. Particularly if you're going to be an ESL teacher, you really are pushing for both, right? When we're doing foreign language, we don't quite have the content burdens that we have, or responsibilities is maybe a more positive word, that we have in ESL. So again, what I like about task-based language teaching, and what I hope this sort of little interactive task showed you, is that it's really well suited toward holistic learning. You can experience language use in a meaningful setting. You can reflect on it. It allows us to see learning as a process. So there's also pre-task and mid-task and post-task things that we could have done, but we didn't, because time and context. Depending on what you're doing, we could have brainstormed lists of words beforehand to sort of ease your way in if we didn't feel like the students had enough of a vocabulary. We could have apparently launched into a whole family memory unit also, which was a bit of an unexpected way to go, but it could have led into, writing short memoirs or things like that. But you had to talk to each other and you had to listen to each other. You didn't so much have to read in this particular task, but you did have to write to accomplish your goal. So all of these things, meaning and content and form, were all a part of your task. Your attention may not have shifted so much, although it did a little bit if you were all counting out syllables and taking time a little bit away from the actual meaning of what you were trying to convey to make sure that you had this form, because the haiku is so rigid in its syllable form. And writing in particular, research shows over and over, can draw learner attention to form. So if I had just asked you to create a haiku but not write it down, it's a different situation for language learners than when they actually have to go write it down and all of a sudden they realize they don't know the spelling, they don't remember whether something's supposed to have a plural ending or an ed ending, or maybe they thought that this was one word and actually their partner knows it's a different word. And so it brings form to the forefront in a way that it doesn't do without with writing. So today's task I chose because writing a haiku is something that we can all do. So we're all highly proficient and fluent in English. So I felt like it wouldn't be coming down to you and giving you something that was more of a language learning task. But it gives us an idea of what it's like to do a task in a language learning class. We don't have the same linguistic gaps that students who are actually learning a language would have. I think it's a really good exercise for student teachers. It doesn't ask them to pretend to be something they're not, like a language learner, because they're not. But it does show, hopefully, that tasks are about using meaningful communication and bringing language to the forefront while you're doing that. So that brings us back to my teaching philosophy, which is that I want to give students meaningful opportunities in the classroom to experience and language learning and to reflect on that, to create their own learning opportunities and learning materials, and to pursue their own interests and specialties. So part of what I strive to do with varying degrees of success is teach students the way I want them to teach. So everything can't always be fun and interactive. We all know this. But when it can, it's nice. And I also want to give students the tools to understand research, which doesn't incorporate what I did today. But I do feel like we have these students for a very short time in their careers. But there's new information coming out all the time. And so even if we are not preparing students to be researchers, hopefully we can prepare them slightly to be consumers of research, so that as innovations come out in their fields, they're able to read some of it and to look at it critically and not just accept everything that they are told, to consider what actually works for them, their teaching style, and their students. And that's all I have for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was interesting. It was fun. We have about 20 minutes, I guess, for questions if people want to ask some. I know we probably have some in the committee, but it's open to anyone. Any thoughts? I'll begin with the question. Yes. So it was a nice activity that we did, the task. Can you imagine a little bit which course you might want to put something like this in, like where it could fit possibly in the kind of sequence of classes? I know you're not that familiar with exactly
Right.
what we offer, but
So,
I don't know if you have some thoughts
just
about
sort of
that.
generally speaking, I think this is something that could go in either some sort of methodologies course where you would, you know, there's lots of different ways to teach, and research supports lots of different things, but if it's not something that resonates with a particular teacher, then they're not going to be able to use it convincingly. So people need to know lots of different ways to do things. So this could definitely, if there were a teaching methodologies course and task-based language teaching were sort of a module within that, this would be a good time to do that. Task-based language teaching also comes up pretty much impossible to avoid it if you're doing like a topics in second language acquisition or something like that. So even if that class isn't focused as much on teaching, though we know the students are studying to be teachers, it could still pop up and be sort of an interactive methodology type thing just to give students an idea and then say, you know, take a methodologies course to learn more.
Nice, thank you. Your last comment was interesting too about giving the students the tools to understand research, because that was really exactly what we say when we have our orientation to the new students in the fall. You know, our students get a master's degree when they get their certification at the same time. So we want them to be critical consumers of the research and then even thinking about possibly producing it and creating knowledge in the field as somebody who's getting a master's degree or a doctorate, perhaps, you know, in the future. So thanks for that.
And I personally like practitioner research. I feel like it's informative.
Yeah.
I mean, it's wonderful when there's collaboration between practitioners and researchers, but I just feel like the teachers are the ones who are in the classroom and they know what their problems are and they know what they want to know and how they want to help their students. And so it's wonderful when they're able to really lead the people who are more focused on research to the right questions.
Yeah, we really want them thinking that way too, so that's great. Christelle, do you have any questions from afar or anybody else? Other comments or questions?
I was just thinking, a thank you, first of all. That's really, really wonderful, even from a distance. You
Just
work
gonna
really
come
well.
so she's
Thanks.
Hi.
Sorry, I said thank you. I really appreciate it. It was wonderful. Even from a distance, it worked really well. So I think, you know, you could also think of doing something like that online or online courses that would work as well. Just a comment, not really